Hi, everybody. Welcome to At the Table. My guest today is Peter Baker, the White House correspondent for the New York Times, with his wife, Susan Glazer of the New Yorker, who's the author of the bestseller, The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021. Peter, thanks so much for coming on. We are talking at a very important time. We're talking right after Donald Trump's been indicted on 37 counts and after he pled not guilty in a Miami courthouse. I want to point out, before I ask you my first question, and to everybody, how Peter and Susan in their book, and all the years of Trump, saw it coming. Peter, you and Susan write that the Trump era is not past. It is America's present, maybe even its future. You go on to say, we could think of no more urgent project than to record and seek to understand what really happened when Trump was in the White House. It is not yet a matter for the archives. It is a report from an active crime scene still under investigation by multiple authorities. So you kind of nailed it. Peter, how does this indictment and Trump's defiant reaction to it, what do you make of it?
Well, it is of a piece in a way, right? Because we saw him throughout his presidency challenge norms and conventions, rules and laws time after time after time. And we learned that some of them aren't in fact enforceable. And the question is whether any of them are, right? We saw time and again that he didn't really actually pay the same heed to classified information, just to name an example. This isn't the first time now that we're talking about these documents. We saw it while he was president. He gave away classified information to Russian visitors in the Oval Office. He posted online a sensitive satellite map of Iran that even had like confidential markings on it. He used a cell phone that his own staff told him again and again was being monitored by the Russians and the Chinese, and it didn't stop him from using it. So he always showed that he didn't care about some of the things that other presidents, almost every other president in our lifetime, of course, cared about. So now this is a test of the system. Do these norms, do these conventions, do these rules matter? Are they enforceable? And should they be enforced against a former president of the United States, even at the risk of a political backlash against the system?
So he is making this a political defense, looking for the court of public opinion, which is going to be quite different than his legal defense. He had a big campaign rally in Bedminster when he came back from Miami. And just a few minutes before we started this conversation, Trump sent out an email saying that he's just raised $6.6 million in the last few days. So it's not as if he doesn't have rivals, though he is the front runner. How do you think this changes the shape of the Republican primary right now?
It's a good question. It's a little early to tell. So far, obviously, it hasn't had some sort of like a surprising seismic change in the race. The early polls that we've seen since the indictment suggest that his support remains strong among Republicans. Many of his Republican rivals, the people who want to tell their Republican voters that they shouldn't pick Trump for the next nominee, are nonetheless standing by him in his argument that this is a political witch hunt. Several are not, obviously more specifically Christie, Asa Hutchinson. But for the most part, you're not hearing the kind of condemnation that you might have expected for a president and a candidate who's been indicted on 37 significant federal charges, including violations of the Espionage Act. Lynn, and you and I have covered politics a long time. There have been times in the past where candidates who had legal trouble still managed to be successful, but never at this level, never, for president of the United States. And he has just transformed the political marketplace. So I think that making predictions is probably a hazardous thing, as we should have been learning from Donald Trump for the last 7 years.
Well, that's so true. So what is kind of remarkable, though, is how people jumped to defend him even before they read the indictment, and how the lengths to exonerate him by using whataboutism, meaning, well, what about Hillary Clinton? What about Joe Biden? And there's explanations on how what he did was different. But Peter, let's just go to, doesn't this indictment at least raise serious questions if he passes the commander-in-chief test? So even if he thought he was entitled to them, which he wasn't, because for all our listeners, so they know, under the Presidential Records Act, as soon as a presidential term ends, National Archives and Records Administrations takes the records and artifacts of an administration into its custody. But Peter, how does what's his magic sauce or his ability to continue to convince people to defend him when, even if he thought he was entitled to have these papers, that he didn't even see fit to tape the boxes up and put them in a very, very secure place, whether or not they were declassified?
You don't think the bathroom or the ballroom at Mar-a-Lago count as a secure facility? Look, he does have a magic sauce on some level with core Republican voters. And it goes down to what you just said. It goes down to whataboutism. It goes back to the idea of selective prosecution. How come Trump is being prosecuted when these others weren't? But you're right to make the point that they're not the same circumstances. Certainly, a lot of people, including the FBI, said that Hillary Clinton was irresponsible in setting up a private email server while she was Secretary of State. But there's no evidence that she obstructed the investigation. There's no evidence that she, in fact, submitted a false affidavit, that she defied a subpoena. All these things that are the case in President Trump's instance. And there's no indication, by the way, that any of these emails had anything to do with nuclear war plans or, secrets on that level. I mean, in fact, I think almost all of the things that she sent while Secretary of State that were later classified as classified, marked as classified, were not marked as classified when she sent them. It was only after the fact they said, well, this is secret stuff. We shouldn't be sending this stuff around. So they were not of the level of the kind of secrets that we are talking about, according to the documents we've seen in court regarding Mar-a-Lago. These are real secrets. Jack Smith was very careful only to charge willful holding of these documents in 31 cases. There were hundreds of documents. He only picked 31 that were obviously super secret, super important, nuclear war plans, things like that. And that were documents that former President Trump kept even after being asked for them back, right? It was not that he brought them, he shouldn't have brought them, let's go ahead and give them back. It's that they asked for them back, he refused to give them back, and so that's why he's being charged. So I think there is a significant difference, but to the voter, it obviously sounds, the simple answer sounds, logical. It's politics. It's a Democrat going after a Republican. She should have been charged. How come he is? It seems to me if you thought she should be charged, then why wouldn't he be charged? I'm not sure why her not being charged means he shouldn't be charged, except I suppose under the idea that if she doesn't get charged, anybody can do anything with classified information forever. But there are a lot of people who are charged with mishandling classified information, including people in the last few weeks who got prison time for a much lesser set of facts than what we see with President Trump.
Right. So, remember, and our listeners might remember, General David Petraeus showed a classified document to his girlfriend.
Yep.
He got in trouble. He got a slap in the hand sentence, but nonetheless, he faced criminal prosecution. Yep. So it's not like this is not, when it rises to a level of prosecution, this is what the Justice Department does. But, the frustrating thing for me as a reporter, I wonder if it is for you, is that I write, your paper has written on the Presidential Records Act, even though he says it exonerates him, it just does not.
No.
You have it there. One of your colleagues wrote in the New York Times, talking about the Trump voter, that one of the thing is that Republican challengers, or just anyone who's trying to describe this story, when you're talking about Republican primary voters who are Trump backers, you have to convince them that in the context of these criminal charges, that holding onto classified documents is a bad thing. It's just very frustrating as a journalist to try to figure out what you could write that people will then go on to understand exactly what you said. This case is mainly about, and this isn't complex, you please give back the documents you took.
Right. What's fascinating is about the defense so far is political and to some extent legal, but not on the facts, right? The political argument is what we just talked about. It's a double standard. Why should he be charged and other people not? the legal argument might be that a judge erred in allowing the prosecutors to look at attorney-client information. That forms part of the indictment that we see in Florida, and they will no doubt litigate that again in Florida. But nobody that I've heard has given a defense saying that what President Trump did is okay, that you can take nuclear secrets with you and leave them in the bathroom in Mar-a-Lago, and that you can defy a subpoena once issued by the government saying, give these back, or that you can submit an affidavit to the government saying, I don't have any more classified documents when you know you do. And that recording that the government has alluded to in its documents, in its indictment, suggests that the president not only knew that what he was holding in his hands was secret, that he was showing it to people, even as he said, I'm not supposed to show this to you, in effect. He says, this is secret. Look at this. That's the words from the recording they have of him meeting with a ghostwriter for Mark Meadows, his former chief of staff. That suggests a certain knowledge that the papers he have are supposed to be kept close, hold, and not shown to people without security clearances. So you don't hear anybody making the argument that he didn't do it, that it's not important, that it's not serious. All you hear are the political arguments, and again, maybe the legal argument as to what should be allowed into evidence.
Right. So this false equivalencies has been taken up by Republican leaders at the highest levels, including House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who, he was asked, do you think it's a good idea to keep classified documents in the bathroom? And he just goes on to say, what about Hillary? What about Biden? What about this? And what about that? So I guess my question for you is this going to be how long do you think the Republican leadership could hold out, especially when we may, sometime in August, have another indictment in a state indictment in Georgia accusing Trump of election interference?
Look, I think Republican leaders are going to defend him as long as they see it as politically advantageous to do so, right? They are defending him not because they agree with him. Actually, if you ask most of these Republicans who are defending him under, some sort of truth serum, they probably wouldn't tell you that they actually think this is okay. What they see, though, is that the base has not abandoned President Trump, former President Trump. And as long as the base is with him, they seem unwilling to challenge him for fear of being at odds with a bulk of the Republican Party. Now, you can make the argument that maybe if they showed the other side, that the base wouldn't stay with Trump quite so much. But everybody who has defied Trump over the last 6-7 years in the Republican Party pretty much has paid a price for it, lost their offices, lost elections, lost primaries. And so they have come to the conclusion that defying Trump at this moment, at least, while the base is still with him, is politically damaging, it to say the least, and they're not willing to do it, most of them, not all, most of them, at the risk of paying that price.
So, Peter, you're also a presidential historian. You've covered multiple administrations, and you had an analysis that you wrote a few days ago where you noted, I'm calling it your full circle analysis, you note, and this is in reference to Hillary Clinton and Trump, the indictment handed up by a federal grand jury that Thursday at the request of special counsel Jack Smith effectively brings the Trump story full circle. Lock her up, the crowds at his campaign rallies chanted with his encouragement. Now he may be the one locked up if convicted of any of the reported counts. So talk about this full circle that you've been reflecting on.
Right. So in 2016, of course, one of his main weapons in the race against Hillary Clinton was that she was irresponsible, if not illegal, in her handling of classified material through the email server, which we just talked about. And he said again and again and again, there's no excuse for this. This disqualifies anybody from running for president. I'm going to really enforce all the laws on classified information. So whatever you think of what should have happened to Hillary Clinton, he certainly didn't live up to the language he used in 2016 when he talked about how important protecting classified information was, because nobody would define what he's done with these classified documents as the highest, best way of protecting our nuclear secrets and our war plans. But that, again, it shows that politics is always about which camp you're in, where you're sitting. It matters that classified information is jeopardized when it's your opponent who's done it. When your guy does it, it's a different story at this point. So
intent is not part of a legal case. I know that. But if you could put on your hat as a practicing political psychologist, what's your best analysis of to Trump's intent in keeping all this stuff?
This is a really good question. I'm glad you asked that because nobody really has focused on this. He's been asked this. Caitlin Collins asked him at the CNN town hall, why did you take the papers? And then he goes off, well, I was entitled to, which is not an answer to the question. Why did you keep the papers? And we can speculate, but we don't have hard facts. The speculation ranges from, was there something involving enemies, or that he wanted to be able to hold over them? Was there some business advantage he might have in holding them? Or was it even simply ego, that he simply loves the idea of having these secrets, and that he has this mentality that these belong to him because he was president, he can do what he wants with them? And he told us time and time again that, Article 2 of the Constitution means I can do anything I want as president. He told us he could declassify things even just by thinking about it. So, it could be just as simple as that mentality. We don't have any evidence that I've seen, not that the prosecutors have filed anyway, suggesting anything more, strategic or mercantile. But it begs the question of why he would put himself in this position, especially after the government made clear that they knew he had documents and sent him a subpoena for them. Why you would continue at that point to resist turning them over, I think remains one of the central unanswered questions. They don't have to answer it in court, but it is a curious thing.
Well, so it could be as simple as he thought it was cool to keep the stuff. One of the things he said, it might have been at his Bedminster rally, is that I still was going through my boxes. Now, the National Archives and Records Administration on June 9th, they don't often respond to stuff, but they responded to some of the allegations out there. And they said, you're supposed to go through your things before you leave office and separate out your personal stuff. And what Trump is saying and acting like as if no one told him the rules, which is not true. NARA, National Archives and Records Administration, said they did have a consultant out there. So he seemed consumed with going through the boxes. Does that suggest to you, and again, this isn't having to do with the legal case against him, do you think he just didn't know what was in there and was consumed with finding out? And that's why he wanted them before he gave them back, if he even entertained that notion?
I mean, it's certainly true that in the final weeks of his presidency, he was more consumed with trying to hold on to the office by overturning the election than conducting a smooth and efficient transition in which you go through documents and you make sure you're taking the right things when you leave the office. It was certainly a chaotic final days. Things were clearly being just thrown into boxes because there hadn't been attention to that part of the transition up until that point. How much that matters to him, I'm not sure. And I could see that maybe for a few months, saying, well, I just want to go through these before I send them back. But again, once you're subpoenaed for them, once the government says, we know you have them, you're not legally entitled to them, and I'm sending you a legal order signed off on by a court saying you have to return them, at that point, it goes beyond just, hey, I'd like to look through them first, right? And it just, it begs the question of what he was doing and why he did. Now, we've talked about the whataboutism, right? Joe Biden had classified documents. It turns out some of his files. Mike Pence had some of his files. But in both those cases, once they discovered them, they both approached the authorities and said, hey, guys, we have things we shouldn't have. Let's turn them over to you. And that's why, of course, the Justice Department said about Mike Pence, we're not going to prosecute. Seems to be at least not a willful intent to violate the law. We don't know what's going to happen with President Biden, but his circumstances seem fairly similar at this point. And that's different than former President Trump. So why did he want to keep them and insist on doing after a court told him he had to give them over? That's the burning question on some level.
It's like going through a stoplight when you see 6 police cars sitting at the intersection.
Yeah, it's begging for trouble. Why do it?
Literally, he did have cameras. It was like, even if he wanted to keep them, here's kind of my cheater's proof. If he thought he really was entitled to them, when he spoke to his lawyer, instead of thinking of ways to get rid of this stuff, he would say, go fight the subpoena in court. I'm entitled to these. They're not. And do it that way. But the point also I've made, and many people have made, is if he simply had returned the stuff, even as late as when the subpoena came, he probably would not have been charged, and certainly wouldn't face the obstruction charges that he is now. So going back to how he's acting now and taking up, in a sense, all the political oxygen in the room when we're at a place as the Republican presidential field seems about formed. How hard is it going to be for the rivals to break through at this point?
Well, it is, because, of course, they're being judged entirely on the frame of Trump versus not Trump, right? How do they either support him, attack him, navigate around him, try to manage him? And that's the only question right now that other Republican candidates really are being asked, because he does, as you say, dominate that conversation. It's a challenge, because if you're not full-throated Trump critic like Chris Christie or Asa Hutchinson, then you're in this place where you're trying to sort of have it both ways on some level. You're trying to say, well, gosh, I'm against weaponization of the Justice Department. I don't think this is fair. But you don't want to exonerate him either, because your job is to try to tell the voters why they should pick you and not him. And certainly one of the arguments you would think that a rival might use is he's not a responsible custodian of the nation's secrets at this point. He doesn't comply with the justice system as you're supposed to. But those are arguments that seem at the moment to be ones that his rivals don't want to make, and that's how they're being judged. So breaking through right now on any other issue, breaking through on abortion or wokeism or law and order or the border or any of those issues that Republicans would like to talk about, is sort of subsumed by this conversation about Trump. Yes or no on Trump?
Well, what is this pressure? Do you think any of them will be under pressure, if nothing else, to differentiate themselves from the pack for any of these rivals to go harder against them?
I mean, it feels like as time goes on, as we get closer to the debates, and then, of course, the beginning of the caucuses and primaries, if the dynamic hasn't shifted, if he's still the dominant player, way above all the other rivals, then I think the pressure begins to increase on his opponents to be more, aggressive in taking him down, because otherwise they're not going to win. Now, a lot of them, I think, are sort of subscribing to the theory of the case that eventually Trump will self-destruct. And once he does, then they might as well be there to pick up the pieces and help hopefully outmaneuver the other ones to take the nomination. That is predicated on the idea that there may still be another indictment, as you alluded to, in Georgia about January 6th. There could be another federal indictment from Jack Smith about the president in January 6th and trying to overturn the election. If those two other indictments come, is there a point at which Republican voters, even those who like Trump, simply say, look, okay, 4 indictments, 3 indictments, I still like the guy. I think this may not be fair, but maybe it's just too much, and maybe we should turn to somebody else. That seems to be what a lot of these other candidates are counting on. Whether it'll work or not, I'm not sure.
So August is going to be probably a month, if we're going to see something happen. It is the month of the first Republican debate, August 24th in Milwaukee, which is where the convention is going to be next year. We'll see who qualifies for it, who doesn't. And we'll know probably if there are more charges in the Georgia case. And we don't yet have a sense of when Jack Smith, who is the special counsel in this classified documents case, does come with more charges on the January 6th thing. But in the closing part of our conversation, I want to just go down and see if you want to handicap or just comment on the people in the race. And let's start with former Vice President Mike Pence. What do you think, Peter?
I just think he has the hardest challenge of all, because he was part of the Trump administration, identifiably the number 2 person in the administration, so loyal to President Trump through 360 some days, basically, of 3 years and 360 some days of their presidency, only to break with him at the very most important, decisive, dramatic moment. And trying to explain why he did that and yet believes in Trump on these other issues is a really hard challenge, I think, to me. Whose lane? Where's the lane for the person who's pro-Trump but anti-January 6th? It's a hard road for him.
Okay, so what bucket does Florida Governor Ron DeSantis? Where's his point?
It seems like he's trying to say that I am the younger Trump. I am the 44-year-old Trump who doesn't have the baggage. If you want an aggressive fighter, if you want somebody who's going to do all the things Trump said he was going to do but didn't do, I'm your guy. So he's going straight for the Trump base, right? He's trying to say, I am Trump 2.0. And, that has a logic to it. And it seemed like for a while that made a lot of sense, but it hasn't shown up in the polls. I think a lot of Republican voters are like, why would I go for the junior guy when I still have the senior guy still around? That may change, but for the moment, DeSantis has not made that case yet to the Trump part of the party.
So former Trump UN ambassador and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley has made in the last few days some comments kind of mildly critical of Trump. Is that, do you think, going to be kind of a straddling some lanes here? What's your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, a little like Pence, she has been on both sides in that sense. Remember, she told us we should never have followed Trump after January 6th. And then within a week or two, she was back at Mar-a-Lago and defending him and attacking his opponents. And so she's, I don't know whether she's appealed enough to the pro-Trump or the anti-Trumpers to have a significant constituency. But I do wonder whether she is now positioning herself to some extent as a place for established Republicans who don't like Trump to go if they've give up on DeSantis, right? If they decide that DeSantis is not really the giant killer that they thought he was early, that they may end up at Nikki Haley because she does at least, she does impress a lot of that part of the party. She hasn't completely turned off the pro-Trump vote in the same way that maybe Mike Pence has or some of the others have. And she might be able to navigate that really kind of that line, I think. But I think it's really tough for her too. She has to explain a lot of her past comments.
Well, true, but she is the only woman in the race right now. And I think if we talk about so much how Republican primaries are won often by suburban and soccer moms, that could be a point. I think her role as the wife of, she is the spouse of somebody who's being deployed right now, gives her a certain kind of gravitas, as well as her chops in talking about foreign policy from the UN.
And she's from South Carolina, one of the early and most important of the Republican primary states.
Where that South Carolina primary vote may be divided because her fellow South Carolinian, Senator Tim Scott's also in the race.
Yes. Yeah. And he's got a very interesting candidate so far. I mean, obviously he's trying to avoid the Trumpian debate by saying, I'm the optimist in the race. I'm the future of the Republican Party. And I'm a place you can go if you're tired of being called a racist because you support Trump. If you support me, clearly you're not a racist, but I'm not about wokeism. I'm proof that wokeism is wrong. I'm proof that the liberal theory of race relations in the United States is wrong, and that you can support me with a sort of more Reagan-esque optimistic vision without quite some of the drama that Trump offers. So, he has an appeal, I think, to a part of the party. Whether he can expand it beyond, the narrow base he's starting from or not, big question. And you're right, he's going to have to split South Carolina with Nikki Haley. It's amazing to have two, top tier candidates from the same place. How that plays out, I haven't been to South Carolina.
Especially in that early state. So I have to admit, until recently, I could not have named, without looking it up, who the governor of North Carolina was. But that person is Republican Doug Burgum, who is running for president. What a long shot, Peter.
Yeah. It's a sign of, the times where basically a lot of people who might not have ever even thought that was a reasonable thing to do decide, what the heck, what do I have to lose? There's a certain, benefit to running, even if you don't get anywhere. You raise your profile, maybe you set yourself up for another race that may be helpful. Maybe you set yourself up to be a vice presidential candidate or a cabinet secretary in a later Republican administration. So you're right. I don't know much about him personally. I don't think anybody does. He has a certain success, I think, in business that's been appealing to people in North Dakota. But I think that lightning may strike, right? And if you're there when it strikes, so be it.
So I left for the end two candidates who definitely have a lane, and it's the lane where they're willing to speak out about Trump. Two former prosecutors, two former governors. I'm talking about Chris Christie, the former New Jersey governor, and Asa Hutchinson, the former Arkansas governor. Chris Christie, let's go first on him. He is probably the most outspoken opponent of Trump, yet we have to say he also once supported Trump. Yeah. Right now, he's a guided missile aimed at Trump. His main, role in this point in the race is to take Trump down. He'd like to win, obviously, as he said, but he understands that he's not going to win unless he takes Trump down. And it seems like, his main goal at the moment is to hammer away at him and take him down. You're right. He was a friend of his. He was a defender of his for a number of years. I think where he really broke with Trump was during COVID.
in 2020, and he hasn't gone back. He's not a popular figure within the Republican Party, but he is a pugilist. He gets attention. He'll shake it up. The debate stage will be a whole lot more interesting with him on it if he gets on it. To watch him and Trump go at it would be fascinating. Whether Christie can translate that into larger support for himself or simply just take bites out of Trump, that's the open question.
So in a sense, does he serve as a blocker then for Asa Hutchinson, who has none of the combativeness of Christie or some of the baggage? Is that, in a sense, if there are people who just say, we want someone with experience and government chops, who's a conservative, but has the least Trump baggage. I mean, that seems to be the theory of the Asa Hutchinson campaign. But can he only prevail if somehow Chris Christie fades? Is there room for both of them in this primary?
Well, it's a good question, right? We've seen this in the past where one candidate takes down a front runner, but doesn't actually benefit him or herself, right? And then somebody else comes along and sort of fills that void. I think that's where Asa Hutchinson may come in. You're right. He's not a Chris Christie in the sense that he doesn't have sort of the pugilistic style. He's a very reserved, mild-mannered, thoughtful guy. He's actually a sort of a throwback in a way to the old Republican Party, one, which was sort of seemed more serious-minded and maybe country club and, definitely conservative, but not like in your face, flame throwing kind of figure. He has his own credentials. I mean, he was an impeachment manager against Bill Clinton way back in the day, though nobody today seems to really remember that. And he's the only one who's been willing to say, other than Chris Christie, flatly, that what Donald Trump has done in many instances was wrong and that it should be, the Republican Party shouldn't stand for that. That's something where most of the other candidates just haven't been willing to go.
Right. And actually, I notice a lot of reporters right now are using, well, it's almost like a litmus test, the question of, will you pardon Donald Trump? Now that's leaping ahead to presuming there is a trial and a guilty verdict. And I want to point out again for our listeners, the presidential pardon power is only for a federal case, not for these state cases that may be pending. What do you think are some of the more important questions? We're in our closing minutes here. Reporters at all our organizations tried their best to fact check and bring out the truth when Trump's habitual serial lies. We see this, if nothing else, on a stepped up basis when he's talking about just the small issue of presidential records. Within a minute or two, he says almost everything he says in a few riffs, especially at Bedminster and that rally after he pled not guilty in a Miami courtroom. Almost everything he said about what you do with presidential records and what he did just was not true. What are some of the questions, though, that at least should be asked, even as we try to get answers and explain things as we have this test to our democracy going forward?
Well, I think it is a test for democracy. I think that's the right way to frame it. I was just been thinking about this, by the way. We should add, of course, that President Trump is in fact innocent until proven guilty. Nobody has convicted him, as you pointed out. There's nothing to pardon in that sense. Although you could use a pardon power even if the trial hasn't happened the way Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon prior to any charges. But you're right. I think that this is a test for democracy, and I think it's a fraught moment. It really is. There's a reason why we haven't prosecuted a former president before, and in part is because we're nervous about the idea of looking like, and maybe in fact setting a precedent for, actual political prosecutions of people who are out of power. Right? On its simplest level, Trump's argument is understandable. He says the guy I ran against last time and who I'm running against this time, his administration has just prosecuted me. Sounds to anybody with any sense of history, like a lot of, we use the term banana republics, those are probably not the term we're supposed to use anymore, but a lot of sort of less developed countries around the world without a system of accountability and stable democracy. But then the flip side is, if you then say, well, we shouldn't be doing that because it will look political, it will raise partisan backlash, what does that mean for accountability? Does that mean that any president can do anything at any time and never face the legal consequences that any other person would face? As you rightly point out, David Petraeus, John Deutsch, and a number of others have over the years been prosecuted on classified information mishandling, does that give a president or a former president a get out of jail free card just because we don't want to tempt the political backlash that might happen? It's a real test. And so do we emerge from this with a feeling that however the outcome in court is, we do have a system that we all can have faith in, or many of us at least have faith in? Or is it the moment when a significant part of the population, not a majority, but a significant part of the population says, well, this is just a hopelessly corrupt system, I don't believe in it anymore. And that has large consequences. And you can see Donald Trump, of course, trying to promote that. He's trying to stoke that because he sees it as both political and possibly in his legal interests.
Peter, and in a sense, I'm glad we're closing and talking about how this is a fraught moment for democracy, because it is, how we cover Trump in the days and months ahead, what his rivals for the Republican nomination decide to do, and how they assess these charges against him and how they handle it, are all the stress tests, in a way, of this period of time we're in, and the tests for our democracy. And with that, Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Peter Baker, New York Times correspondent, with his wife, the New Yorker Susan Glazer, are the authors of The Divider, Trump in the White House 2017-2021. And today, Peter, you have taken us all the way to 2023 and a bit into 2024. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Lynn. It's always great to talk to you.
Thank you.